Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 136 chainsaw. Customer complaint is that they took it all apart and it still doesn't work. No one bothered to write on the work order or inform me why they took it apart to begin with. So here we are. I got a bucket, and I'd like to point out a garbage can full of parts. No reason why it's apart. And there you go. So we're kind of looking the machine over. I mean, it looks like I have all the major pieces here. Got a screw stuck to the flywheel magnet. That's something you always want to watch for when you get yourself in a situation like this. You know, we're going to go through and do some basic checks. You know, if the cylinder's not scored, probably going to look at the carburetor and the fuel system and put it back together and hope it doesn't have any air leaks. So look at that, they got a there's a brand new spark plug in it, and it still doesn't run, darn it. Sorry. The cylinder looks good, so I'm happy about that. We'll probably be able to get this thing going for him. Torque this down to spec. There we go. That air filter looks decent. That might be on the newer side. Here's our throttle linkage. I wonder if all the parts were in that bucket. So that, yeah, I like to look at that air filter. Let's pull the air filter holder or adapter off of here. There's two nuts that hold it in place. And then there's two studs that hold the carburetor in place. There's also a plate in front of those studs that mounts down to the tray below the carburetor. So there's a lot going on here to get this carburetor off. And you can see I'm using a swivel socket to get in here. I think it's 7mm. Look at them go. So now we've got the two screws out of the bottom of the plate and the two studs out, so that support plate can come out of place. Now the carburetor is loose. And judging by the color of that fuel line right there, it's old, maybe original. This looks sketchy. I still got 10 fingers, so that's a good thing. Pulling the fuel line out. I mean, the filter's laying on the bench, so I know there wasn't one on the other end. Let's take a look inside this tank and see if there's any bits and pieces left in here. Alright, we're going to cut a taper on the end of our fuel line. We pushed the fuel line through the tank, alright? We pulled it through and we got some line on each side. We're removing the, I don't know, dust boot maybe? I don't know what they call that grommet that goes over the adjusting screws. Picking stuff up off the floor, drop the choke lever. Let's pull the pump. Yeah, I know this is the metering diaphragm cover. Let's pull this off of here. to expose a kind of stiff metering diaphragm. See if we can get it off of here. Yeah, that thing's stuck on there pretty good. I would say that if it's not the original, it's been on there a long time. Came off fairly clean. Just need to scrape a little bit on top of the carb to get rid of that last bit of gasket. We'll look at the other side of the pump diaphragm gasket. Look at that carb stand, hey. If you think you need one of them, there's a link in the description. That's it. So that's an old looking pump diaphragm, but look what we found in here, a little surprise. Bunch of wood. Now, were they running this without a fuel filter? I mean, they took this thing all apart, and the fuel filter was not on the fuel line. I don't know if it rotted off of there, or if they removed it, if it was just floating around in the tank and they decided to take it out of there. I don't know. Nobody told me. I'm just the guy that gets to fix it. Alright, metering diaphragms back in place. I mean, the rest of the carb looked good. I mean, how can you get any dirt inside the carb when you got all that wood blocking passage of anything else? And this is not unusual. The internal bits of the carburetor, if I see evidence that, you know, this thing had just skanky old fuel rotting away inside of it, I'm going to take a whole different excuse me. I'm going to take a whole different approach to repairing this. Possibly the ultrasonic cleaner or replacing the carburetor. But I got to tell you, I would say 95% of my carburetor repairs just require new metering diaphragm and pump diaphragm gaskets. So we got it bolted back together. Put this dust boot back on here. And our throttle linkage, we're going to attach that while we can. And our choke linkage, we're going to snap that into place. Just like that. Usually on Husqvarnas, the choke lever has some type of choke symbol imprinted on the lever itself, so you can always tell which way is up. If it's your first time doing it, look at the lever itself and it should become obvious how it goes back on there. Routing of this fuel line is important. To be careful not to pinch it, because it goes behind that dust boot and against the insulation wall. And if you route it wrong, you can actually pinch it off and not get any fuel flow. So now we're going to put the support bracket in front of the carburetor, because we're going to have to run our studs through that bracket first. And I'm putting a little bit of Loctite on these studs. You know, way back in the day, there was a problem that I experienced with a few units where these studs would come loose, or the nuts on the studs would come loose. And if you look at this setup, after we put the air filter holder in place. Those two nuts, if they come loose, you know, they got one place they could go, and that's in the carburetor. And we don't want that. So the studs are locked down. Now we're screwing the plate down. And on most units, there's a grounding wire from the kill switch that connects to that plate on one of the screws. Now I want to put the fuel line on the carburetor, but it's a small diameter hose, so I have to kind of stretch it a little bit or warm it up. And using this modified snap ring pliers, I can just kind of stretch the hose a little bit enough to push on the carburetor. There we go. So again, no primer bulb on this unit. And we're not going to use that old filter either. So we're deciding how long to cut the fuel line. I want it to lay in the bottom of the tank, but I also want to be able to remove it from the tank to service the filter. So about where I got it cut off there is a happy medium between the laying in the tank and coming out of the tank. Not being so long that it curls back up on the other side of the tank and sticks up out of the fuel level. If that makes sense. Alright, there's our filter. Put our cap back in place. What do we want to do next? I mean, there's plenty of parts laying on a bench. Just start somewhere, right? I'm putting a little bit of Loctite on the end of the studs for the air filter holder. Again, those two nuts that go on here. I've seen one come loose before and get caught in that choke plate. I don't know if a nut would make it all the way past the throttle plate. What's a drop of Loctite though to prevent that? Alright, we got that cranked down. I guess we could work on the starter. Kind of dirty though. Let's get some of this cleaned up. Look at that, magic. It's all clean. Our air conductor, that needs to be cleaned. It's full of dirt. I walked it over to the sink and washed it, and then I'm just blowing it off with air. Now it's nice and shiny. So there's two studs on that blue piece. They're locating pins. And there's two holes in that air conductor. And you got to get this lined up here. Once you get those two pins through the two holes, then you know it's in the right place. You can just snap it down. Otherwise, if you try and put the starter on here, it's going to get all jammed up. So we sorted our screws and figured out which ones belong in the starter. What do we got left for screws? M4. Which is kind of convenient because the handle needs 4 screws. So there's a rubber buffer that's going on the handle, and then it locates into the crankcase here. And we got 2 long screws and 2 short screws. Whenever you're in this situation, put the short screws in the bottom so they don't poke through the fuel tank and hit the bottom of the oil tank. We're going to put some grease in the nose sprocket. We'll get this thing barred up. Chain rolls nice on there. The brake seems to work. put our air filter on. Just a slotted screw head on here. We don't have screws in the top cover. I don't know why we didn't get those. They weren't in a garbage can. It came with bar oil in it though. And I already know there's no fuel in it, so we're going to top this thing off and then try and start it. And if it does start, then we'll tune it a little bit. Enough to get it outside and drop it in a log and do the final tuning on it. So that's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 136 chainsaw that showed up in a garbage can. Thanks for watching.